Good evening. Get wired up here so folks can hear us. Good that you're here this evening on what America deems a very important night, the Super Bowl. It will still be there when we get finished because it won't be over with till about 10:30. And so we'll get through about 9:15 and get through in plenty of time. Turn your Bibles to Acts 10. We're going through the book of Acts this month, asking you to read a chapter a day. And I thought tonight we would cover the 10th chapter of the book of Acts. Little boy always asked his teacher, every time she would go to talking about something in class, he would always ask her, is this going to be on the test? Is this going to be on the test? Well, there's a lot of Christians like that. They deal with the Bible and a study of the Bible by asking that very question, is this going to be on the test? As if to say, how much or how little can I or must I do in order to have heaven as my home? And that's really, you might say, well, people don't ask that for real, but they do proverbially. And it's really a sad thing when you stop to think about it. And in many ways, that question is answered by Acts chapter 10. In Acts chapter 10, we find a man by the name of Cornelius. He is a centurion. He is over 100 soldiers. The scriptures also tell us about him that he was a devout man, he was devoted, that he was a God-fearing man, that he had a devotion to God, and thus feared God, according to about verse 2 or 3. He was a good father, evidently. He considered his house. He was concerned about his house. Matter of fact, towards the end of the story, when Peter comes, and we might recall the story with regards to that in just a few minutes, but suffice it to say now that when Peter came, that Cornelius gathered his whole house together. So he was a good father. He was a philanthropist. He gave to others. He helped out others. And what a wonderful trait that is, to think that here's a man that's willing to help others. He was prayerful. We know that scriptures tell us that he was praying. Matter of fact, look at the story in Acts 10. If you didn't read it this week, I hope that you did. But if you didn't, you might recall, we'll just kind of give a thumbnail sketch of it, that he one day was praying. And basically God told him to send for Peter. Peter then, remember, he had that vision of animals, and Peter is basically told by God that everybody's acceptable, that there's no, if you will, there's no difference in between folks that from a standpoint of where we come from. That God, as Peter comes to the conclusion of the truth I perceive, that God is no respecter of persons. And that's true. It doesn't matter where you come from. It's what you believe. And Peter reminds us there, really, as Peter tells his story. He tells Cornelius, remember, when Peter comes, Cornelius tells his story to Peter, and Peter says, well, guess what? I was praying too. A couple of days later, and God wanted me to tell you this. And so, though Cornelius was prayerful, he was a man of good report. He had a good reputation. That's interesting. And stop and think about that. Because you look at this list, he was a centurion. He was top, or not the top, but he was a man that had responsibility. He was a man that was in charge. He was a man that had power. He was a man considered in the Roman government, but yet he was considered a man of good report. When people began to talk about Cornelius, here's what they started with. Cornelius, he's a good guy. He's a good man. And so Cornelius was a man of good report. He was a man who took religion seriously. He was religious. And what a wonderful trait that is. And, not everybody believes the way I believe. And I wish they did. I wish that they believed the way I believed. I wish they believed what I believed. But at the same time, too, I do respect those that have another belief and the understanding that hopefully I can direct their belief. But at the same time, too, I respect them because invariably that belief will make them better persons. Not necessarily make them in line for heaven. It will make them good people. And it makes them good prospects as well. And so we see of Cornelius that he was a man that really took his religion seriously. He listened when God told him, send for Peter. He listened. He did what he was told to do. But the problem with Cornelius was that he was lost. Cornelius had all of these good traits. Centurion, devout, good father, philanthropist. He had all of these good traits. A man that took religion seriously, a man that was prayerful, a man that really from all standpoints, we'd look at him and the world would look at him and say, man, there was a guy that loved God. There was a guy that listened to God. There was a guy that he was just really on top of his game from a standpoint of spirituality. But yet when you read the text in Acts chapter 10, even though you get all of those good characteristics, especially verses 2 and 3 and 4, right there. Of course, you get a few of these a little later on, but you get all of these characteristics. You say, man, that's great. But he was lost. And so it begs the question, and we ask the question, then how religious should we be? How religious must we be? If Cornelius was all of these things, if he had all of these characteristics, all of these traits, and he really was a good man, but he was still considered lost, what about us? How religious should we be? What do we need to believe? What do we need to be doing? Well, let's look at some things. Let's look at some things out of Cornelius' life that really help us understand really where we need to be. First of all, we need to be religious enough that we help others. I know you say, well, Brother Paul, this is something that you hit on quite often, and it is. But it's very important that we remember that we're all about not just, if you will, just the idea of worship, but we are the church. And we need to get out of the four walls, and we need to move on, and we need to help others. Paul realized that was important. Paul realized that it was important to reach out to help others. And he talked about how that if a person's going to fulfill the royal law, he must help others. He must be one that is willing to help, willing to desire not only his own things, as he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 24, but also the things of others. What can I do to help? How can I be of assistance to you? How can I go out of my way to make your day a little bit better? You might say, well, preacher, that's not the way the world sees it. And yet then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of folks that are not Christians that believe in helping people. That's right. There are those, first of all, that aren't Christians, and so therefore they care very little about people. It's just not in their vision. Their vision is all about self. But then go to the other extreme, and there are those that really, from a standpoint of religion, are not strong religiously, but they care about others. I had a man tell me once that where he worked, that if he really needed to go get some money for some people, that oftentimes he went to those that didn't go to church. He said those that sometimes, went out on the weekends and did things. But he said they were willing to give for others. And so we look not only on our own things, but we also look on the things of others. So a religious man is one, first of all, that has enough about him to say, okay, what can I do to help you? When Paul in Galatians chapter 2, verse 10, meets up with Peter and others in Galatians 2, there's a working out of, okay, who are we going to go to? So you had Peter, and think about the story in Acts. Think about how that the first part of the book of Acts dealt with Peter. And then we jump over, and all of a sudden it's all about Paul. Well, there had to be a meeting of the minds, and in Galatians chapter 2, there is a meeting of the minds. And basically, here's the meeting of the minds. Okay, Peter, you have your ministry. Paul says, okay, I have my ministry. Peter, where are you going to go? And where do you want me to go? And Paul basically says that he wanted me to take care of the poor. He says, which I was already doing. I was willing to do. I was glad to do it. You see, how religious should we be? Well, we should be religious enough, first of all, to help others, to extend what others need and to see to that need. But then, secondly, enough to lift up others. Cornelius lifted people up. He made people better in many ways by his presence. That's our calling, isn't it? Our calling is to hand in hand, walk together. Two are better than one. Why? Well, as the proverb goes, because we fall into the ditch. One's what? Well, he can't get himself up. But two are better than one, for if one falls in the ditch, there's nothing happens. But if you have two, one can help his brother. As Christians, we are really in the business of encouraging others, lifting up others, helping others. Encourage them, first of all, through life. Exhort one another daily. The Hebrew writer wrote in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13. That's our calling. To be individuals that are willing, individuals that build up individuals in their daily life. You know, when you think about the word encourage, there's a little word in there. When you get it down into the original word, and it's inside that word encourage is the word cardia. Well, cardia, you've probably guessed it. You're thinking ahead of me. Cardiac. Cardia is literally the heart. And so when we encourage someone, what are we doing? We are giving them heart. Not just our heart, we're giving them heart. We are placing that within them. And so as Christians, we have a responsibility to encourage one another through daily life. But encourage each other spiritually. When we were at Pomona, it was a tradition that was started long before we ever got there. But when we had a baptism, there was usually one of our song leaders that as soon as this individual was placed in the water, as soon as they came up out of the water, a song leader would start. I want to see. And the church would echo, I want to see. And then we would go through one or two people, and we would ultimately say, of course, the church. But when those gates are open wide, I want to sit at Jesus' side. I want to see, and then we'd fill in the blank up there. That's what Christianity's about. Christianity's about lifting others up, encouraging others, building up others, showing them the way home. You know, Paul talked about the spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians 12 and 13 and 14. Do you remember what he said in verse 9 of the 14th chapter? There he makes, or verse 19, he makes an interesting statement. His statement was simply this. He said, in talking about tongues, he said, I'd rather speak with 5 words that people know than to speak in thousands of words that folks don't understand. I'd rather, and of course, the context there is the idea of teaching and using your words properly and being one that is able to build others up, to set them in the direction of heaven. Eisenhower, when he was general, had gone to inspect some men. And he had this inspection, and of course it was very formal, and all the soldiers were very formal, and Eisenhower was very formal. And he got to the end of the line, and he went to turn around, and there was a mud puddle right there, and he got a little twisted, and he fell in the mud puddle. And some of the soldiers laughed out just before they caught themselves. The commanding officer went to Eisenhower, apologized, easy for me to say, apologized for his soldiers and for what they had done. Eisenhower said, oh no, leave them alone. They probably got more out of that than they did this whole exercise of inspection. We need to sometimes quit taking ourselves so seriously and see what we can do to encourage others. But how religious should we be? Well, we should be religious enough to submit to God. James reminds us, James 4, that we're to submit to God, draw near to God. But submit to God and submit to His will. If you go back to Acts chapter 10, verse 34 and 35, Peter makes a statement. He says, I realize, I'm paraphrasing now, I realize that God is no respecter of person. But in every nation, he that fears God and works righteousness shall be accepted of him. Now, think about those two concepts. Peter says, here's who's accepted of God. It doesn't matter whether he comes from the United States or he comes from Russia. It doesn't matter whether he comes from India or he comes from South Africa. It doesn't matter where he comes from. He says if an individual is willing to fear God, if he respects Him enough to listen to what He has to say, if he respects Him enough to honor His commands, if he respects Him enough to draw near to Him, if he respects Him enough to take heed to what He has to say, so he fears God and he works righteousness. There's a lot of folks that don't like those last two words, works righteousness. And they don't like it because, first of all, when you talk about works righteousness, for some it seems to imply, well, we're going to earn our salvation. No. Just the idea of working righteousness just simply means doing what God has told us to do. In the book of Micah, the 6th chapter, there's the question asked, what does the Lord require of you? But in verse 6 it says, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To do justly, to do righteous, to do what God would have you to do. For not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven. That makes sense, doesn't it? You see, as Solomon went through all the things in life in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13, he went through many things to try to find meaning, to try to find happiness. He searched for happiness. But he did it, he looked in all different areas. Areas that people of the world look into, even today. He looked into wine. He looked into women. He looked into wealth. He said all of these things didn't bring him happiness. He said all of these things were vanity and vexation of the spirit. In other words, they were empty. They had no meaning. They seemingly had no purpose. They had nothing that truly grounded him or made him stronger. But then he came to the conclusion for which he spoke for a good while. While he talked about dying, he then talked about how that would remind the youth, remember your creators in the days of your youth. Well, why is that so important? Because as he continues on in chapter 12, you're probably ahead of me. He says in verse 13, finally, brethren, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Fear God and keep His commandments. Submit to God. How religious should we be? Well, we submit to God. But now, we've got to understand, we've got to characterize that submission to God. When do we submit? When we want to. If we're asking the question tonight, how religious should we be? And we say, well, we've got to obey God. We have to ask ourselves, well, is obedience to God, is it something that is occasional? Is it something that when it fits me and my needs, or when is it? Well, when God called us to obey Him, He never said, now when it's all right with you, it'll be all right. He doesn't say, you pick the time and you pick the place, and it can vary. No. He calls us to complete submission, complete obedience, that it's constant, that it's all the time. But when we talk about, well, how religious should we be? Well, then we should be religious enough to obey God's will. And we do it all the time. There's a lot of folks, though, that are not willing to do that. There's a lot of folks that for whatever reason, that's not their calling. They just choose not to. They say, oh, I obey. Well, how about this in your life? Or how about that? Or how about this that's going on in your life? Or how about what you're not doing? Oh, well, that's all right. Folks, though, are like the story of two men that went out on a boat one day. But while out on the boat, a storm came up. And as they were heading in the midst of the storm, the boat capsized. Both were thrown out of the boat into the water. One survived, the other drowned. The difference was the one that survived had a life jacket on, the one that drowned did not. And so people began to question him after the storm. Well, didn't your buddy have a life jacket? Well, he had one, but he didn't want to put it on. And so he didn't. There's a lot of folks that have Bibles in their homes. There's a lot of folks that call themselves Christians. But they're not willing to put on what's written in this Word. And because they're not willing to put it on, and they're not willing to put it on completely, they're not following what the psalmist said in Psalm 119, verse 2. They're not walking in the ways of His testimonies. You might say, well, they're following the will of God. Yeah, but they're only following it when they want to. If we're going to ask ourselves, how religious should we be? Cornelius would probably say, you be submissive to God in all things, not just in part, but in all things. And so, how religious should we be? Enough to overcome Satan. Paul would write to the church at Corinth. Paul was he was concerned with the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter. And he said, I'm jealous of you with godly jealousy, for I've espoused you to one husband. In other words, he says, I've committed you to God. I've committed you, I've turned you over to God, I've given you to God. And he said, I'm concerned you're not doing what you need to be doing. I'm concerned that you're not following what you need to follow. We realize that Christ is the one that sets us free, right? The 4th chapter, one of the first acts of Jesus was to do what? Go into the synagogue, right? When he went into the synagogue, what was there? Well, pretty much it was kind of an empty room. If a city had 10 Jews, they would build a synagogue. And there they would assemble. There was no furniture really in the synagogue. You sat around pretty much the outer walls. There up what would be considered the front, there might be a little raised bench, which the teacher oftentimes would sit on. Behind the bench, there would be a little box. And in that little box would be the scriptures that they had. The different rolls, the different scrolls that they had. And in Luke chapter 4, Jesus came in one day, and he came into the synagogue, and he was asked to read, because their worship service, if you will, often simply put, was a reading of the scriptures, a reading of part of the scrolls, and then the teacher would teach something from that, and then that was pretty much the worship. And so when Jesus found what he was looking for, you might say, what? Well, I'm paraphrasing, but if you go back and look, it seems as if, at least to me, that Jesus didn't just, go over there and... I've had kids that Jay purposefully reads, when he reads scriptures like on Sunday morning, he has purposeful text picked out. But sometimes in years past, I've had folks read scriptures, and they just open their Bible wherever their Bible fell. That's where they opened. That's where they read. Well, Jesus was looking for the scripture. And he found in Isaiah, and he found the passage that said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to set at liberty those that are bruised. Preach deliverance to the captives and the recovering of sight to the blind." Powerful, powerful. Because when he closed the scroll, when he put it back in the box, then guess what he said? He said, "The scriptures are fulfilled in your hearing today." But did you notice what he said he came for? Jesus came to set folks free. Jesus came to give us freedom, to set us free from sin, to set us free from the bondage of sin. This afternoon, I think probably all of you know that there's a few of us that go to NHC and do a devotional for the good folks there. This afternoon I spoke on Colossians chapter 1, verse 13 and 14, in which Paul reminds us there what Christ has done for us. That he has delivered us from the power of darkness, that he has translated, or the New King James says, that he has conveyed us into the kingdom of his dear Son. And then verse 14 says, "In whom we have redemption through his blood." He's delivered me, he's rescued me. He's conveyed, or translated is the idea of carried. It's literally, as I told the folks there, the word itself is the idea of individuals that have been deported, so to speak. They have been transported from one place to another. Antiochus IV brought 2,000 folks from Babylonian captivity and brought them over to Colossae. And so this was a word that was familiar to the people of that day. But notice that he says that he has carried them over. He's translated them into the kingdom of his dear Son. In other words, Jesus did what? He took us out of the world of sin, and he carried us and placed us within his kingdom, the church. And the church is those that, what are we told in Ephesians 5? It's the saved. Christ saved the church, in whom we have redemption through his blood. We've been redeemed, but we've been redeemed by the blood of Christ. We've been set free. We've been set free by Christ. And so we have to remember, we have to understand that as John would write in Revelation chapter 7, verse 14, "Blessed are they that die in the Lord." Oh, that's chapter 14, excuse me. In chapter 7, he says, "Blessed are those that have overcome." They've overcome him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of the testimony, and they love not their lives to death. Those that are willing to follow the Lord. How religious should we be? Enough to follow the Lord. Why? Because those are the individuals that are willing to fight Satan. When we begin to say yes to Satan, we give him a foxhole. We give him a toehold. We give him a little grip. And once he has a little grip, all he's wanting is just a little grip. He goes for more. How religious should we be? We should be religious enough to tell Satan no and to tell the Lord yes. Sometimes we're like the preacher one time. There was a family once that one Saturday, as they were out in their fields, a rattlesnake bit one of the members. Rushed to the hospital. The preacher was called in to come and meet them in the emergency room for fear that the young man was going to die. The old man, father of the family, asked the preacher, "Please pray for my boy. Pray that he'll be well." He said, "I promise you, I'm going to come to church tomorrow." "No, I haven't been to church in a long time." But he said, "I'm going to come to church." And he says, "All my family is going to come to church tomorrow. And we're going to start coming. We're going to be there all the time." And so the preacher prayed, "Father, thank you for this day. And please send more rattlesnakes so people will come to church." And there's thought there. Thought is that we need to be individuals that if we're going to be truly what God would have us to be, and we ask ourselves, well, how religious should we be? Religious enough to walk with God, so that we overcome Satan and we don't give him a stronghold. For as we hold to God, he holds to us. That's what Peter said. And I know you think, well, that's a favorite expression of yours, Brother Paul. It is, because 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 is one of those great promises of God that I hold to. We're kept by the power of God through faith. The word kept is the idea of guarded. We're held, if you will. We're kept by the power of God. We're held by the power of God through faith. So God is holding us as we, through faith, by means of faith, hold God. And so holding, I'm held. How religious should I be? Well, I should be religious enough that the cross is something I'm not ashamed of, but it's something that I uphold. That Christ is something that I'm willing to tell others about, and I'm willing to do the best I can in living the life that I can for Him. I may fail. Matter of fact, may is probably not the best word. I will fail. But I'll get back up. And thanks be to God that He is the God that is forgiving, and He will say, okay, it's all right. At the same time, too, I'm trying. I'm striving. I'm pushing. I'm pushing towards that home in heaven. How religious should I be? I should be religious enough that God is first and foremost in my life. Religious enough that folks see Jesus in me. And religious enough that I'm walking daily with Him. That's how religious I should be. So this evening, if you're not a New Testament child of God, Cornelius teaches us a great lesson. Walk with God. He'll walk with you. And so this evening, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, our prayer is that you'll come while together we stand and sing.